From David Zwirner, this is Dialogues, a podcast about artists and the way they think.
My thing with the gatekeepers is I'm more interested in just knocking down the gates.
I feel like you have to follow the artist, and I think that that's a different way to think about criticism and, curatorial practice.
I'm Lucas Werner, and every episode features a conversation. We're taking artists, writers, philosophers, designers, and musicians, and putting them in conversation with each other to explore what it means to make things today. This week's pairing, the photographer Tyler Mitchell and the writer and art critic Antoine Sargent. Tyler and Antoine have emerged as two of the most exciting young voices moving between the worlds of art and fashion. And 2 years ago, when he was only 23, Tyler became the first Black photographer to shoot the cover of American Vogue. And those images of Beyoncé really felt like they prompted a cultural conversation that needed to happen. Tyler is also a fine artist, a fine art photographer. He opened a show in January at the ICP in New York, which is sadly closed now. And I met him in the context of a Roy DeCarava exhibition we hosted at the gallery in 2019, where Tyler gave a walkthrough that tied images from the 1950s and 60s to a contemporary way of seeing and of being in the world as a photographer, and showed the way that Roy had broken boundaries for young Black photographers today. Antoine's writing has appeared in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, among many other places. He's also organized exhibitions, but I met Antoine in the context of a big book he did for Aperture called The New Black Vanguard, Photography Between Art and Fashion, in which he identified a group of young Black photographers that were really blurring the lines between fashion, editorial, and fine art photography. And one of those photographers was Tyler Mitchell, and there's an image of Tyler's on one of the covers of that book. So these two really know each other well, and as you'll hear, they're great supporters and also really honest critics of each other. We could start maybe with the New Black Vanguard, and maybe you could tell a little bit about the background of that idea, how it sort of came together as now a show and a book.
Yeah, the new Black Vanguard features 15 photographers working internationally with ideas surrounding art and fashion. They're kind of pulling from both of those worlds to create their own universes, kind of to think about beauty and race and power and what is possible in the space of a photograph. But how it began actually is with Tyler. The Aperture was really interested in working with Tyler.
I felt it was too early.
Felt it was too early.
What the ask was, do you want to make a book? And so many photographers have amazing books with Aperture, and so I felt like I'd had like editorials and I'd had like commercial stuff I was making, but I didn't feel like I had like a solid like body of work, like Zanelli Mahali level, or like Joel Meyerowitz level. Like,
Fair.
so I actually said like I feel it's too early, and yeah.
Yeah, the photographers I'm most interested in right now really have used the medium to force both art and fashion institutions to pay attention to them. And they've largely done that by circumventing them. And I think that's a story. And I think that if there were a group of young white photographers who had done the same thing, right, changed the industry the ways that they have, there would have been no question. There'd been 10 fucking books on them. They each would have had their own book, right? And so I was just like, I felt lucky because I was like sitting here watching this kind of happen. I had relationships with Tyler. I had relationships with others who had built up kind of to this moment, right? So someone like AWOL, right? Someone like, who obviously, someone like Joshua Kissy, who started Street Etiquette in 2008, this blog and, and all these things. And I just felt like it was time, it was a moment to kind of put that history on the record and then kind of create a beautiful object that really spoke beyond just kind of the confines of the art world and really kind of spoke to everyday people who kind of experience these images online or in magazines or if they venture into museums. And so I was trying to hold all of that stuff in my mind as I was putting together the book.
So this is not something I was even thinking about asking, but as you mentioned it, so many of the photographers do work between fashion and visual art. And I feel that that's sort of quintessential to this, new Black Vanguard and maybe to the Vanguard in general, that these genre distinctions don't really matter anymore. And, or at least, Tyler, you came and spoke about Roy DeCarava, and I think you very kind of honestly said, this is how I have been able to get people to look at my images, you know,
Mm.
in editorials. And so I'm curious if you think how you're thinking about that difference, because at the same time, you recognize that being in the context of someone like Roy is much different
Yeah.
than, or feels different
Yeah.
than being part of a fashion editorial, you know?
No, totally. It definitely does feel different, and obviously the worlds kind of do have, their own context. And I just feel like honestly, there are people like a Virgil Abloh who are blending and moving between these different worlds so seamlessly, and they're mainly context for him to play with his universe of work. And so I feel like that might be what some of the photographers in this book are doing on some level, like with images, like they're just kind of viewing these different outlets as context to place their work in, and then this context, it isn't better or worse, it's just different. And this whether that be on a wall or in a book or in a fashion magazine, they're all kind of ways to speak about Black identity and about beauty and about clothes and about society. And that was kind of, and I thought this like resulting product was like, way better than a single artist monograph, because it brings all these kind of moments together and actually makes kind of a catalog of a real kind of build up to something. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. But I also think that one of the things that when you talk about the boundaries and talk about, yes, you and your generation of photographers, which is like fuck that, and rightfully so, because if you think about the boundaries, if you think about the boundaries per se, photography, right, um as something that the art world even start taking seriously. That only starts in the late 1960s, early 1970s. You really kind of get a real push with Robert Mapplethorpe's work, right? That it becomes and why that is because it became commodifiable, right?
Mm.
And so you had to kind of figure out a way in photo to make a distinction between images that were widely available and images that were collectible, right?
Right.
And so you have this solidifying of genres in photo that otherwise didn't really matter all that much. Because if you think about someone like Richard Avedon, right, who moved in and out of certain genres, right, but that same type of movement, it's really important to acknowledge, wasn't given to someone like James Banar, right, or wasn't given to someone like James Van Der Zee, or wasn't given to someone like Rode Carrabba, right? So they had to kind of work in a more kind of constricted way if they wanted their works to be taken seriously. And even then, no, they weren't, right? This is decades and decades later that we were having conversations about these photographers who were working and creating in those communities, for decades.
But it's kind of amazing how much in the book you emphasize how important their work was to
Right.
allow us to do what we're doing, because they had to kind of break so many boundaries in their context. Like Roy alone had to do so much to really position himself as an art photographer, until he got a huge retrospective at MoMA and gained the respect of Ansel Adams and Edward Steichen, so many legendary photographers. So he had to do all that so that we could kind of do what we're doing now, which is seamlessly moving between.
I feel like you have to follow the artist, right? I feel like in anything, as someone who is, a critic, or if I'm organizing exhibitions, what I'm basically doing is following what the artists are telling me, is happening, right? And I think that that's a different way to think about criticism and, curatorial practice, right? I think that for so long we've tried, again, to force certain people try to force their wills on what was kind of happening, right? Because you have Basquiat in 1980s walking, Comme des Garçons shows. You have, so you have always had this kind of intermingling. I think that there have been, educational, financial, whatever forces, editorial forces that wanted to keep those worlds separate to not only kind of wrangle value out of those kind of separations, but also control, right? And so if you controlled, Vogue magazine, or if you controlled the photo at MoMA or whatever, you can, allow the artists that want into those spaces
Yeah.
and to kind of do whatever they want in those spaces, and you can keep the other ones that you don't want in out.
So the follow up, and maybe this is interesting when you talked about the attention Tyler is getting in particular, but there are other younger artists that I think are feeling that heat in a way.
Mhm.
That it does also feel like a moment where the power centers really are around the artists, right?
Right,
More than
exactly.
they have been before.
For sure.
And is that something that you sense, like, it's not like curators are not,
Nope.
there's no the sort of gatekeepers are not really keeping the gates anymore. They're trying to move the gates to find out where the heat is
Right.
and be in conversation with artists. I mean,
That might be true. Yeah, I think so.
I think there are just it's now just a couple of there are less, right, gatekeepers, right?
yeah,
So I think that, yeah, before it was the curator, or it was the magazine editor, right? Like in those two worlds, those were the people who, said what was what, right? Now you can, what I love about this generation, what I love even what you've done, I think people, and I constantly correct us in interviews. I think people, there's this kind of subtle way of talking about, your historic cover with Vogue, and there's this, Vogue, gave him this cover, right? And I think that, like, yes, on a practical level, someone at Vogue reached out to you, right? That happened. But there was also this other thing that what this happened is like it's not just by chance that you did this, right? And it's not just by chance that at 23, when there's, lots of other photographers that could have, that should have, that could, all of these things for that cover, they did, right? And I think that people underestimate first of all, the work, but also the ways in which you knew how you had to move to make sure that that happened, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is something that's always like that level of finesse, like it's something not accounted for. Like, we're all kind of in these worlds in some way, and like no one, does anything or rarely do people do things because out of the goodness of their heart, especially take a chance like that, right?
Right.
And so I don't know, maybe
I think
yeah,
I
I'd love
think
to hear
to
about
I
that.
think yeah, to expand on that, like my thing with the gatekeepers is I'm more interested in kind of like just kind of knocking down the gates. It's not getting rid of gatekeepers, but it's actually if we can just as I've always been as transparent as possible, like even in working with you, you know things that I don't know, and then we can have that exchange because
right.
then you're able to kind of support and then we're able to have a dialogue and then I'm able to talk about what I'm thinking about. And that should be the relationship between like a so like quote unquote gatekeeper and an artist, right? Because I think actually the
Mm.
gatekeepers can kind of just if they open the gates and they let like whatever is supposed to come in, then you might have a space for something interesting and new. Like that was my insistence on moving into fashion because at first, before really doing big fashion commissions, I was outside fashion, doing more music and backstage photography, and I was a film student at NYU, and I was making music videos, and so I never really thought that actually pushing my way into fashion was gonna work,
Mm.
but being insistent in that level of finesse and kind of just being as transparent as possible, I think, with gatekeepers and being like, "This is what I want, and
Mhm.
this is what I think I deserve," and being very kind of decisive and choosing different opportunities with intention. Like, I think that's what led to this moment, and I think everybody with the internet, there was more vulnerability, there was more openness around what people were doing and what they were able to do that allowed all these photographers to start kinda thinking this way.
Right.
Like, that's why I'm not kinda just referencing myself or just talking about my own practice because all these photographers grew up with at least 5 years of Instagram along with making their practices, so they were able to see like, "Oh, if I saw somebody across the world like Campbell Addy making his own magazine,
Right.
he's not waiting for days to commission him for 15 pages, but he's gonna make his own magazine, and Campbell actually commissioned me to do a cover for his magazine." Then these dialogues started happening, and then we were able to all help each other up on the way to kind of like changing that conversation with gatekeepers, so
Yeah.
And you know what happens in that's a beautiful illustration, right? That what happens then is someone like me or someone like you or someone, in the art world, who might be narrowly focused on what the art world is and those traditions and, keeping those institutions or whatever. We come across, Tyler Mitchell, Campbell Addy, Renel Madrino, whoever, and we see that they have 300,000 followers and that they, have built whole communities
Mm.
around what they do. And you and in some ways we're like, okay, well, how did we miss that? Or
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
do we not know that this generation were, creating in their own ways, and we call ourselves, critics and curators and dealers and whatever, and we think it like they think of ourselves, with our hands on the pulse, and it's like there's this whole other thing happening.
It raises the question for me about the kind of whole issue of authority and where it comes from. And what I guess what I'm getting at is you've got the authority of an audience, right? Which
Right.
is one kind of authority. Then you've got the authority of expertise, which I
Right.
would call sort of academic authority.
Yep.
And it seems to me that a lot of breaking down of the gates is also really challenging the academic authority
For sure.
with audience authority. It's saying if people are paying attention and they're moved by something, art is about moving people, and the story that you've been telling needs to be amended in some way. That said, there is something to be said for the expertise side. I mean, you
Oh, for
certainly are
sure.
someone who has, educated yourself
Right.
largely very deeply and widely on a number of topics. And that
Mhm.
education is giving you the tools to do the kind of things that you're doing.
Right.
And I'm just curious how you feel this next generation of creative people navigates that. Like the whole question of it, there are certain pipelines, and we'll talk about those
Right.
later, but largely those are not as relevant as they might once have been in terms of art historians and that path leading to curators
Yeah.
and curators making the same decisions based on with whom they studied with and so on and so forth. It's more now, I think, artists making decisions in conversation with other artists, in conversation with creative collaborators.
Right.
I think it's nice to have like that council of advisors. That's
Mm.
kind of what I go to, is like a group of friends, a group of collaborators. Antoine is definitely one of my biggest ones, who I kind of talk to all the time about just daily decisions, like related to big art choices, like, and or just big anything choices, related to image making. And I think council of advisors is one way. And I also think in terms, I really love that way of looking at there's expertise and there's audience. And I think if you can really master both, because I don't think it's about putting all your eggs in one basket.
Totally.
Like if you just have this huge audience and you're leading them into this like senseless, mob mentality place, then it's just everyone's losing. And if you have only expertise and kind of no way to communicate
That's
that, then nobody's really getting at anything. So it's like I've been learning a lot through people like Antoine about kind of my own craft in a
Mm.
more like scholarly way, but also in a more historic way. And just trying to dig deeper into that, because now I feel like the audience is there and I really want to know what I'm talking about. I think it felt really important to me immediately after the Vogue cover to really hone in on that level of like expertise.
Your education was pretty formal too.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, that's true. Also, just NYU Film School and Deborah Willis, understudy student slash pupil. All of those things. Definitely my education was formal and like going to like a private school in the South and everything else. But it really felt even more important after the Vogue cover to really just start to learn more about history.
Maybe just for the audiences listening to this, you would take us through that Vogue cover story. I mean, I'm sure you've talked about it before,
Yeah.
but from your like, how did it unfold? What were the actual steps? What actually happened?
Yeah, because I basically, I mean, almost a year before the Vogue cover itself, I was in London. I graduated school in the spring of 2017. In the fall of 2017, I got a one-way ticket to London. I decided I want to really pursue kind of meeting with agencies, meeting with magazines, and I really wanted to just get into fashion, dive in. I don't know why. I was completely outside it, but I was inspired by photographers like Vivian Sasson, Wolfgang Tillmans, Ari Markopoulos, these people who were doing commissions, but then also had their own personal kind of things that they were doing and blending all of it into one. And then basically I went to London for 2 months and no magazine wanted to commission me for anything. I would send 10 ideas to every magazine and nobody was really commissioning. And so kind of went back a bit defeated, but kept pushing. And essentially it became a bit of like a breadcrumb trail of things. I met Jimmy Moffat, who founded Art and Commerce and represents Stephen Meisel. And I met Campbell Addy, who in London commissioned me and is in the New Black Vanguard book to shoot a cover with Kelsey Liu for his magazine Knee Journal. And so London was a kind of a ticket to some acceptance in fashion, because then ID would commission me, and London's a huge city for fashion. And so then Jimmy Moffat, Campbell Addy, just starting to get like that council of advisors and that community going was really important, but also just making sure the work was really strong and just really fucking good. Like, and just kind of then continuing from there, Jimmy put me in his Red Hook Lab show
Mm.
in New York, which was the first time I ever saw my work on a wall.
Wow.
Before that,
Always in magazines, right? Yeah.
always in magazines or on Instagram. And that was the summer of 2018. And I got into that was an open call show for all new artists, unrepresented, kind of gallery represented, unagency represented. That same summer, I got into Antoine's summer open show. So I was curated into 2 group shows that summer, which was a big summer for me. And the creative director of Vogue saw my work at either one or both of that shows. And that was then it was that combined with a couple other things. It was combined with the work I'd done for Teen Vogue, which was shooting Emma Gonzalez for the cover of Teen Vogue's last print issue
Mhm.
after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting. So it was like there was this political element, there was this like fashion element and this art element that all like clicked at once.
Mm.
And I think
Yeah.
then the conversations kept going, and then Raul Martinez, creative director of Vogue, called me.
And then, when you got in, I mean, obviously Beyonce is the subject of the cover, and I think that the myth around it is that you retained creative control of the final image.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about hearing your side of that. And not that we need to kind of go into the politics of how these work.
No,
but
yeah.
we do know that creative directors and publications, gatekeepers, tend to want to exert influence
Yeah.
on the kind of image you make. And I think that's why artists typically do not
Do that.
And
work with them.
and especially
But there was I mean, I don't speak out of turn, I'll let you talk about how much if you want to, but there was something in the way that you handled that situation that maybe resulted in a different outcome if you did not kind of assert yourself, right?
Yeah. That was a big conversation because, again, I think leading up to, I think my work always pointed towards no matter what context I was within, there was still this very strong voice that was in all of my work. And so I think that was the pre-existing context to how you might know me as a photographer, that I wasn't just going to approach a commission kind of with a style that photographers before me might approach it, which is kind of an executionary style of what's the brief, what does the creative director want, how many double page spreads or how many single page spreads, and then they kind of think in terms of that math. I don't really think that way. And so I think that pre-existing condition allowed for a dialogue with Vogue and with Anna Wintour that was a lot more open and allowed me to be a lot more, like you said, kind of assertive. And I think that also comes from, I think a lot of photographers are doing that now who are in this book. And I think we've been doing that where the commissions we've been able to come in and really kind of open things up and not kind of be like, okay, it's 3 double page spreads and then it's 6 single page spreads and we have to have her in this look in front of this background. It was way more free than that. And it was really from the very first conversation with Vogue, it was very much, we want these pictures to feel like your pictures, your personal work. And we want these pictures to feel as intimate as you in a room with one of your best friends and a fabric behind that you would hang behind them in your apartment. And that was what I was doing. And so I said, okay, well, not only do I not know anything else, but also that's kind of what I kind of need to insist and have the space to be able to do is I need to be able to make Beyonce feel a part of that photographic world. And I need to be able to have that space to work and do that.
And that's just not and I think part of what I think like as my role in this book, it's to just keep on saying that, this is because these artists have gone about this differently, right? That they had said, you know what, I'm going to be, kind of create my own path. But so when I do get opportunities, life changing opportunities, I know what I do, I know who I am,
Right.
right? And I think that's a different kind of,
And I would walk away.
and I will
if
walk
I'm not
away.
allowed to be who I am, right? That's the sort of
And that's something you see in this generation that I just have not seen previously.
yeah.
Like people are ready to like,
Walk
I'm
away.
not doing that.
Yeah. People can easily sense that I would feel
No.
no kind of way about walking away from something. And that's not a bratty thing, but I think that's actually a very amazing thing about the internet is that people are able to see more
Right.
there's more visibility around how much things are really worth. And then that's happening in all industries. There was everything that was coming out in the film industry about men actors who are being paid way more than
Yeah.
women actors and that whole movement and that frontier. And then there was so much about transparency within a photography community about, hey, what's your day rate and what are you getting paid? If I do that lookbook, like what would that be? And there was an
And
actual
also how you're treating
conversation
women,
and dialogue.
how
Yeah.
you're treating
Yeah.
your subject.
And how we're treating our subjects.
Because I
Yeah.
think that also led to an opening in some of these traditional magazines that would have not been there,
Mhm.
right? Because I think that when you have the same 6 people shoot your covers every year, and then 4 of them are accused of sexual assault that you can no longer use because the public is saying no more of this,
Right.
you got to find some new talent.
Yeah. I mean, what's amazing too, what I also think is happening in this world, and maybe that was the impetus for the fashion question, is that, it used to be that galleries were sort of the place where the artist had the most freedom,
Yep.
right? Like your studio and what would happen in a gallery. In a
Yeah.
gallery, you could shape your exhibition and present your work in exactly the way you wanted to within the confines of
Confines
whatever
of,
that space is. And it felt like everything else was much more restrictive, right? And it seems like the way brands, what people want now, and I know it from publishing books, like I can always tell what really resonates with people is when you hand over a lot of control
Right.
to artists in a process. And that's a little bit what you were saying too.
Yep. I mean, there's an example in this book. Burberry commissioned 3 other photographers from the book to create some images around a capsule collection that they did that celebrated the book, right? And early on in that conversation, there was an understanding that Burberry was not going to try to tell them what to do. And that was the basis of the whole thing. That literally was like, here are the clothes, here's a budget,
Do whatever.
let us know if you need anything,
Yeah.
you know? And I think and that's what, made that project, I think, successful in the sense that they were unlike any images that Burberry had previously shot, and that you saw the artist's voice, right? You saw that kind of come through, and they made some money.
Something is happening in the art world, which is this massive attention, and it's happening in all creative fields. But I think the art world, for us, it's more every day
Right.
on Black artists, right?
Right.
Black artists are being celebrated, given shows, collected, bought in a way that's sort of like out the gate that we've never really seen before.
Right.
Like these kind of market phenomenon of graduating from Yale or coming out of the Studio Museum and suddenly having this massive market being
Right.
offered major top shows. And then, the dark side, which is this kind of
Right.
horrible after effect because a career hasn't properly been built.
Right. Exactly.
And I'm just curious to hear, in a funny way, what you said earlier, but your take on that,
I mean, I think it's happening. I think that we're all not going to make it, you know? I think that there is a danger in allowing a young artist who should be, in the studio struggling, figuring it out, too many platforms. I think you're seeing, at least with a few of them, the really bad side of that, meaning that we're getting really shitty work that we have to, that people are just kind of applauding in ways that are not going to be helpful to the artist. And then you have a secondary market that is ferocious and that's going to be ferocious, right? There's this thing that's happening. And it starts in some ways, in my opinion, this is totally just my opinion, at Yale, with these at Yale, which is where it's open season. That gallerists and galleries get to go there and engage artists, and it shortcuts the education, because if a gallery from New York is coming up and saying, "Hey, we're going to put you in a group show or whatever, or we're going to put you in or we're going to give you your own show," then what criticism can any of the critics that they employ, what can they say? They've already kind of made it, in that way, right? And so I think that, like, it's some of the institutional forces need to kind of think about their role in the art that we get to see, right? And how it's definitely, academic and curatorial and exceptional and aesthetic, but it's also in relationship to the market. And I think that we need to all be a little bit more honest about the roles that we play in helping to
create value.
create values around an artist's work, because and quite frankly, it's like something that I'm constantly always struggling with. It's this person who, I mean, Tyler inadvertently, kind of called me a gatekeeper, and I didn't really ever think of myself that way, like, in the sense that I'm just like kind of like, oh, I'm just kind of out here doing,
Right.
but yeah, and
I think for a lot of young Black artists,
I am.
they are looking to you.
I
They
think I
are
saw you
saying,
as one.
where's the young guiding light? Here's a person who's done the reading and who
Right.
can actually tell me how to better understand what I'm trying to do.
Exactly.
And that's all it really should be, as you said, to be a gatekeeper. I mean, I think in the past it's been much more nefarious. 'Cause It's
Exactly.
really about closing doors.
Right.
But in the best case, it's like, if you're curious, I'm here to enable.
Exactly.
Like, I'm here to empower.
Yeah, and I think that's
But I also
why.
have to be a little bit more, everyone she needs to look in the mirror. And I think that, like, now that is a thing that I think I'm becoming more aware of, that I have to be a bit more critical. I mean, I need to,
No, I mean,
go
now comes the
really super kind of traditional and, talk some shit about some shows that I don't, in just some, like, just in keeping the tradition alive, but also in that I really do think I think myself as a critic first and foremost, no matter what I do. Part of the issue is that very often these are also the people I came of age with, right? These are the people that when no one would let me write about their work, they did, right? And I think you form a certain allegiance to your generation, to your peers, but I also think that there needs to be an exchange. And I think that, some of my peers, and have, there's this thing that they think they're above criticism. That, or if someone leveled criticism, that it should be someone who is black or within the circle within the community. And I don't think that, I think that's just such a dangerous place to be. I really do.
Well, I think, part of what's happening, and, I'd be curious what you think, Tyler, is that, the traditional role of the critic as this kind of removed personality, that's just changed. You know what I mean? And in a
Right.
funny way,
Or I
I
think
look
people got more honest about what was happening.
exactly, which is that there were a million friendships behind the scenes and everyone was patting everyone on the back, and
100%.
that's just the way the world works,
100%.
Right.
right? And so now it's saying, like, I'm a person in a context, in a historical moment. I speak to the people that I speak with, and I also am someone who has judgments and can pass judgment
Exactly.
objectively in quotes, because what is that anyway? But I can
Yep.
remove myself somewhat from the judgments that I pass, and I can do that. And it sounds like it's about exercising that second function as well as the kind of primary function, which is being in a network of people and allowing them and enabling them.
For sure, but
Right.
I also think, and I'll let you weigh in, Tyler, but I also think that for me, criticism isn't necessarily about, and this is a break from what we have had traditionally, it's really about starting where where the artists say the work is, right? And then stress testing those assumptions, and do those assumptions show up in the work, and if so, how do they show up in the work, right? And so I think that, like, I'm still willing to be generous enough to say, okay, let's start on your turf, right? Opposed to going into a exhibition and being the almighty I, And I think, because I'm just like, who cares?
Yeah, it's
Right.
true. It's just not that interesting.
Yeah, like, it's just not that interesting. Like, who cares what, someone who has ignored, Carrie James Marshall for 30 years have to say about Carrie James Marshall? Like, are you going to, kind of announce why you ignored him for 30 years? Because I think that'd be more interesting than you, like, now just feeling the need to laud praise because the art world has gotten behind that artist. And so I think that, and also I got on Twitter the other day and challenged, some of these critics, some of our 30, 40-year-old, critics who have been in these positions to go see the show and to engage the argument of the show, right? I mean, you can't have, on one hand, 500, 600, 700 people show up at a gallery in Chelsea, right, to see art, and then say that, somehow, what you're offering kind of a look at the contemporary landscape, right?
Right.
So, like,
Yeah.
we shall see,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
happens.
And I wanted to hear a little bit about Tyler, your project that you're in the process of thinking through and working on.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about this idea of the boom of buying black art and going back to that, because I think a lot of my work or a lot of my mind has been on that basically since conversations we've had with Antoine, and my mind has basically been on how to fortify what I'm doing in terms of spending time in the studio more, not being out 3 nights a week and not being kind of, I guess, it's just like all this homework stuff that I just need to do to make sure my work is good and that it can't really be fucked with. Like, then I can think about the navigational roadmap stuff, like where to, like, just all of those questions that black artists are having right now of like, how do I fortify and make sure I have a career for the next 40 years, not just get bought up by every institution to have a show and then the work gets dumped. Like, that's our existential crisis right now. And I think then that goes into what you're saying about how we dialogue and how Antoine challenges me and how I challenge Antoine. And then I guess what I'm trying to say is, in addition to making sure the work is good and that I'm happy with it, all of the choices that go into how to make sure that I have a long career need to kind of be had with a circle of people.
Yes.
Right.
Like,
Right. That there's, again, the council of advisors.
Yeah,
That you are
that's what I'm-
creating a context in which that work will continue to have a life.
yeah,
Because work continues to have a life when people are talking and thinking about it.
Right,
That is
exactly.
simply, that is why a museum show, forget the symbolism of a
Exactly.
museum show. The reality is, why is a museum show important? Because people get to see the fucking work.
right.
Exactly.
Which otherwise would be in a studio and no one would see, or in a private home. Why is it a priority to sell to museums? Because other human beings can then
Can see
access
it.
the work. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like,
Then-
that is the
yeah.
fundamental priority.
Right.
And the curators then over time get to make connections as the history of art moves beyond you, right? And I think, like, that's just super important. And I think that, like, me and Tyler, it's not to say that we agree on everything, because we don't, but I think there's also this thing of, the easiest way I can describe our relationship is when he was in the middle of the Vogue storm, like all the attention and all this stuff. And Robin Gavin, the fashion critic at the Washington Post, has won a Pulitzer for it, like very important Black critic.
Oh yeah, didn't she write like a
And she
really
wrote
mean
she
criticism?
was not feeling
She
the
didn't like the
images,
shoot.
right? She did
didn't like
not
the-
like the shoot. She was saying that
She said they're bad fashion images.
they're bad, but which is she said they were not iconic fashion images, right? But you were not trying to
I'm cool with that.
achieve a fashion image. And
No.
so for her, someone who is very much, steeped in a tradition of fashion images need to be iconic, etc., Tyler was so far outside of that, which I think speaks to his project, right? And she made a comment on it. And so I sent him a thing. I go, I know there are a lot of people blowing smoke up your ass right now.
I love that
But
article.
You should
And I
read
also-
this article
Yeah.
not because I was trying to tear him down or bring him down, was because in those moments where you have, say a book that everyone's loving, or say, this kind of attention, I think the best kind of thing to keep you level are people who might not share the same opinion among people who might, who do, right? And so I think that, like, for me, that was one way that I knew when Tyler responded, was like, yeah, I'll read it. Let me read it. Let me try to, and then we kind of had this kind of exchange about like what she thought and, and all these things, that I knew that he was someone kind of interested in a different kind of engagement, right? He wasn't just there to be lauded and having every, the problem with this moment is that everything that comes out of a studio by a young Black artist these days, and it's coming out fast, the expectation is for everyone to say, oh, this is great.
And it needs to be the
Like
gold
everything,
standard. Yeah, it needs to be-
everything you make is great. Like, and you're not challenged, to your, like, you have to challenge yourself. You have to have a conversation to say that, okay, like everything I write isn't great, And for me, it's like, it's how I do it, how I bear writing, is that to know that I'm going to get up every day and I'm going to try again, right? And that's the exchange, at least for me personally, that matters the most, right? Is me kind of having that exchange with myself and the page, and then a public.
Yeah. And then I think there's another level, which is kind of, well, first I loved that criticism that she wrote. And when you sent me that, I was like, tell me more about this. And I feel like anytime somebody kind of challenges or writes something like that about what I'm making, I'm really, really good and eager to kind of lean in and hear
Right.
more. And not
That's
just
rare.
kind of
That's
get
not.
into-
Oh,
and that's hard
not
because
very
I love like kind of taking that beating in some weird way, because I actually really want to make it better. Like
Right.
I'm kind of always asking myself, how can it be better, or how could
Or
this
c-
be better? And I'm not really
or clarify your
looking-
position.
yeah, or clarify your position.
Because for her, it wasn't that like you could make that image, because you could have made a traditional iconic, kind of fashion image, but that wasn't what you were trying to do. And so
No.
I thought that when she wrote that, it was a way for you to
maybe understand my fundamental position as a photographer,
And
or
double
my
down.
aim or my goal, exactly, and double down. And then there were so many people who I was reading on like forums and blogs, like the Fashion Spot, like
Mhm.
traditional people who really love, the old Vogue,
Right.
quote unquote, the Avedon Vogue and the Mizell Vogue. They love that stuff. And then my shoot comes out and they're like, what the hell is this? They're like, where's the old? This is how Beyonce is supposed to look. And there was like a bashing of like my images. And I read all that because I actually really was like, oh, okay. Like, I understand that this has a certain energy and resonance. The people who want that kind of Avedon image, I don't produce that. Now I can actually learn more about my practice and what I'm subconsciously doing with making pictures. Like, I'm making things that are intimate, that kind of feel undone or pared back or not glamorized or glamored up. And that's how I'm kind of trying to depict or paint the Black subjects I'm photographing. And so when you see Beyonce on that cover with the kind of laundry line, which is like such a clear reference to the proverbial space of the domestic Black woman or the working Black woman in these Pan-African colors on that dress, that's kind of like, that's what I'm going for. I'm not going for a glamour and glitz kind of image. So that it's good, like that conversation, and then also just having a conversation with the council of advisors who are able to push me forward or say, I don't like that, or I don't like this. That's the most important part. And then I think we need more of that within Black circles. That's what I think. And I think we need more, because there's a lot of patting on the back. And I think sometimes I can be hard and extreme with this, but I really feel that also it's about we're talking about gatekeepers and institutions and artists. There's more need for forming our institutions. We always say that, and that message needs to be preached and beat into the ground. Like, I think, and it still needs to be beaten to the ground, still needs to be talked about. We need to form our own so that we're able to, then have these conversations, welcome people in, form a circle, and have dialogues, and then make things better. And then not see artists' work just plummet to the bottom of the ocean and get forgotten.
I mean, there had, and again, there are histories, right? I mean, in 1970s and 80s and early 90s, there were real debates around, the role of art, but made by Black artists from within the community to the community, right? And so you have this debate around what Black art means, right? And you have that comes out of the late 1960s, early 70s, when we are as a nation kind of going through an identity crisis, right? And you have people saying things, taking, stances and saying that, Black art needs to be social, and it has a social end, and it cannot just be aesthetic, right? But then you have someone like Ed Clark, right? Who's making these, and his work making sublime, kind of post-war abstraction, but his work he's being told that he's not Black enough, right? That he's not making art that was going to help free Black people, right? And these were debates that they were having to each other's faces, right?
Right.
Like right or wrong, or however you personally, but these were debates that were being held, right? Right.
And what's scary now is that everybody feels an immense pressure, and myself included, I'm not excluded from this, to perform and look like we're doing great. In the midst of trying to have these dialogues, which take years.
Yeah. Also, a studio practice is not great. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, it's a corrective process.
Exactly,
It's just like a writing process, not glamorous. You know what I
Exactly,
mean? Like,
right.
glamorous is, when you have the show.
Well,
So
but-
if you want to
yeah.
perform glamour, then you are going to have to sidestep the processes that actually are what creates all the work. you
Yeah,
know,
and
like
I
real
do
work.
I do fault Instagram for that in some ways,
Yeah.
where you get on, people get online, artists get online, and they like, I don't show, like, I'm on Instagram all the time. I don't show you like, oh, I wrote a sentence today, so don't show me the fucking hand you made.
I
You know
know.
what I mean? Like I mean, it really is.
Yeah, work in progress is a very strange. It's also
it-
infiltrating, again, that quiet studio space. Which
Exactly.
needs to be different.
When people say studio practices, our generation, and when they say, and I think we can talk about our generation kind of openly and critically because we are all of the same, generation. I think when we say studio practice, it's not what people like this correct. Like when you talk about corrective process, when you talk about experimentation, when you talk about, messy, when you talk about failure, because that's usually what you're doing in the studio 90% of the time. That's what I'm doing on the page 90% of the time until I get to a place, right? And talk about all the images that you took, right? That just does not, they don't fucking work,
No.
right? You're not posting that on Instagram.
No,
Hey
no.
guys, I failed today, right? But I do think that's more so than a generation. It's a cultural thing, because I think when Tyler said, we feel a need to perform a level of success. And I think that's an American cultural thing.
And I feel strangely currently in between those two. Like, feel somewhat on a bridge between those two kind of pillars. Like, I haven't in my life, had that ability to kind of fail and have this studio practice that's had these meandering years. Like, I was immediately catapulted into this space that I'm in now, and now I have to learn and do the homework and the research. And so I just feel a lot like right now I have this kind of vessel in communication with, I guess, young artists, like, who are just learning and just getting what they want to do off of Instagram. And that's young Atlanta photographers who feel, I want to make a book. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not what happens first. Like, trying to kind of mentor them and trying to kind of talk to them. And then also connected to this older generation, people who have more kind of institutional ties, and ask me, who are young Atlanta photographers who I could kind of work. And then I do feel somewhat between, I'm an artist myself, and I'm interested in making things and then telling stories, but I also have this like connection between two generations, I feel, because of the position I'm in, and this responsibility because of the history I made.
Yeah.
On that note, I think I want to say thank you both, Tyler and Antoine, for this afternoon and for talking. I think it's really, really special to have you both. So thank you for your honesty.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Dialogues is produced by David Zwerner. You can find out more about the artists on this series by going to davidzwerner.com/dialogues. And if you liked what you heard, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It really does help other people discover the show. I'm Lucas Werner, Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you join us again next time.